Hello everyone, welcome back to Talking Politics. My name is Nico Johnson. Today I'm with Jack Posobiec, who is an anchor at One American News Network. And on top of that, he's a great friend of TPM. He's done a lot for us, so it's wonderful to have him on. Thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, guys. Appreciate you doing this, and good luck on all the new podcast ventures there, Nico.
Oh, thank you. We're trying our best. So I was interested to learn the other day that you actually have lived in China for a bit. You speak Chinese. So you're in a good, I suppose you have some perspective to be able to understand what's emerging from the Beijing apparatchiks. And in fact, I was interested to learn on top of that, that you warned the Post Millennial that the coronavirus was going to be something big. How did you know that was coming?
Yeah, so well, on the coronavirus pandemic, that's something where, as someone who is a Mandarin speaker, also when I was in the Navy as an intelligence officer, I was predominantly focused on East Asia and countries there. Of course, East Asia is currently and increasingly dominated by the threat of China as it's rising. So as a Mandarin linguist, China was always something that was an area of study for me for the years I spent in the intelligence community. And then ever since I made the switch to media, I've also kept China as a very important focus of my work. And starting in late December, early January of 2019 into 2020, we started seeing reports coming out on social media, Chinese social media in Mandarin, but talking about this new pandemic, and then also talking about arrests and talking about lockdowns. And locking down an entire city, an entire population in China, that's something that flies in the face of what you'd normally see the Chinese authorities doing. Typically, their response to these things, their main tactic is to quell anything, censor everything online, which is what you did see, but then also admit that there's no fault. Never admit fault, never admit you've done anything wrong. Mm-hmm. Always uphold the best interests of the regime, always uphold the image of the party. They're constantly almost paranoid about their image management and their brand representation within China. And so for them to start locking things down on a scale that they did, we're talking 25 million people very early on in the city of Wuhan and the surrounding province. I knew that if it had gotten to the level where they were already making those types of public pronouncements, then they've already gone through their entire system of checks. They've gone through every step they could. And this is something that even the government of China, which is of course one of the most powerful forces on the face of the planet, even the government of China couldn't hold this thing back, couldn't lock this thing down. And if it was that powerful, it certainly would be something that would come into the United States and spread throughout the world. And so I very early on was tweeting about this. I reached out to the White House. I threw up a tweet very early in January saying, we need to stop flights with China. This is an immediate issue. The president did that several days later. I then joined with Steve Bannon, Raheem Kassam. We started a podcast called War Room Pandemic. I was the first, and on January 25th, and really just started ringing the alarm about this. And it's actually kind of funny because there's this narrative in the media now that they'll say conservative Trump supporters don't care about the virus or don't want to talk about the virus and everything. And I said, excuse me, we were actually the first ones on the scene when you guys were pushing that ridiculous impeachment that nobody even talks about anymore because it was such a joke.
Yeah, I find it really interesting how you and Bannon sort of caught hold of this early on and realized the potential for it. Not how serious it was, but the consequences of what it will mean, how we will eventually have to stand up to China as a result of that. So do you think the Republican Party are finally taking the necessary steps in standing up to the Chinese regime?
No, I don't think that all the Republicans in the United States are quite there yet, because I think there's a disconnect between sort of the mainstream conservative establishment position, which is this sort of laissez-faire, free trade, very pro-corporation attitude that the United States should trade with everybody. We should have free trade agreements all around the world. Every country is basically the same. Every country is just a market where we can sell goods. And so China is just a market unlike any other. Or I should say like any other. And so that is a huge disconnect from sort of what you'd call the new populist right, or the America First Republicans and conservatives that have started to come up through the Trump movement starting in 2016. You can see this in people who were those early Trump supporters, 2015, 2016, who look at this coronavirus pandemic as actually a symptom, in a sense, of the United States and the West's complete capitulation and an almost symbiotic relationship that we've entered into with this totalitarian regime out of Beijing, where our pharmaceuticals are made there, right? We couldn't get masks because they were made out of there. The open borders meant that we couldn't control who was coming in and out of the country. Even at some
Yeah.
points when they stopped the flights, they were still, they announced flights were stopped, but flights kept going and people kept coming in. And so this was a huge repudiation of everything that's going on over the past 30 years in the United States, and a complete validation of everything that new populist right has been talking about since 2015, and in some cases even predating that.
Yeah, and if I may use an example from my homeland, in 2017, 2018, the finance minister sort of thought China was the future. And he argued strongly that Britain should invest more in China and should encourage free trade and more partnerships and more investment, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing is, we all knew what China was like back then. We all knew that they were an odious regime. And the fact that we were allowing this to go forward seems to me, firstly, to be pretty negligent and also just amoral. You know, why were the previous administrations so willing to just dismiss all of that or to shrug it off and go through with these trade deals and partnerships?
Well, the basic idea was that they tried to play sort of a two-step game with the American people or the people of the West, where they would say, sure, we'll criticize your human rights record, right? And what does that mean? They say, well, you throw words at them.
Yeah.
Right? You throw words at them. George R. R. Martin has a great phrase, words are wind, right? And they're free. So you throw words at them. Oh, we criticize your human rights record. We have an issue with your human rights here. We have an issue with your human rights there. All the meanwhile, nothing ever happens. The complete occupation of Tibet has never changed since 1950, despite everything that Hollywood's thrown at it. Previously threw at it, I should say. They've stopped doing that because they want the films to be able to be distributed in China now. So Brad Pitt doesn't talk about that, even though he made a seminal movie called 7 Years in Tibet. It's a fantastic movie about what went on there, and horrific violence and occupation and actual oppression of the Tibetan people, right? Oppression is a word that we hear a lot. And so we tend to forget what the original meaning, the correct meaning of the word oppression is. That's oppression. What's going on to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang? I've been to Xinjiang. I've spent time there. Actually, when I lived in China, when I lived in Shanghai, the specific neighborhood I lived on, right near Suzhou Creek, had a very large Uyghur community. And so the Uyghurs are people that I've known since 2007, 2008. I've been there in 2010. I traveled to Urumqi, which is the capital out there in Xinjiang, and was always treated well by them. But you can see how China was moving in, how they created policies that were essentially amounting to ethnic cleansing, at least in the sense that they were bringing in Han citizens and then pushing the Uyghurs further and further to the fringes of their own homeland. Now, in the time since I've left, it's about a decade ago, they've erected this massive new concentration camp system. They're using forced abortions. They're using sterilizations. I don't know what the word ethnic cleansing means if it doesn't apply to what China is doing to the Uyghurs. And so previous administrations, though, they said, who cares? The Chamber of Commerce wants free trade. The Chamber wants their money. They want to be sourced out from what is essentially slave labor in China for the low wages. So you want that, you move that over, you're going to increase your profit margin. Americans are buying cheap TVs at Walmart with big screens all of a sudden, and everybody just turns a blind eye to everything that China is doing. But don't worry, because we're going to throw some strongly worded letters at them, and we're going to, we might even give a speech at the UN, but nothing ever actually changes. And because you're not going to get the leaders of China to respond to anything other than military pressure, which is obviously something that doesn't always make sense because of the variables that it leads to. Nobody wants war with China, but the
Yeah.
economic levers are what makes so much sense to use in this case. And that's something that you've constantly and consistently seen the new populist right pushing for in terms of China. Now, obviously, there's a lot of issues domestically here in the West right now, but I would make the argument that a lot of that is also due to this parasitic relationship that we've entered into with China.
Yeah, it's horrific what they're doing to the Uyghurs, and I think you make a good point. And every generation has a great test. You know, my grandparents, obviously, it was Nazi Germany. My father grew up and lived for some time with the USSR. Do you think that China, under this Beijing, technocrats, will be our generation's test? Is it that serious?
I think it's becoming to that level, and you can hear my 2-year-old son is so interested in this discussion that he's knocking on the door to try to find out what's going on. He said,
Absolutely.
Daddy, are you talking about the CCP right now? Yes, I am, son. Yes, I am. I've got to teach you about them.
It can be like one of those BBC interviews when the kids sort of ram through the door and you have to do your best to sort of keep
And
going on.
we've got these like circular covers on our door handles that you have to apply pressure in a certain way to get it to actually turn, and he
Yeah.
hasn't figured out how to use it yet. So I think I'm clear for now, but he kind of used sort of daddy's office as like the forbidden playground. So every time the door's closed, he's like, daddy, come on in, let's talk about China. But no, I think as to what you said in terms of the great test, it's actually even in some senses more complicated than our test with the Soviet Union, because of course that was a test for world hegemony, sort of which system would take over the world.
Yeah.
The US and the Soviet Union, or in the West and the Soviet Union, never had a strong economic relationship, an economic base, a trading bloc that we shared with the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact nations. Of course, I'm Polish, from Polish background, so I have a lot invested in that.
Hmm.
But the economic relationship wasn't there. It was almost two competing systems. Now you're actually seeing a much more thorny issue because the West has gotten so deeply in bed with China. We've become reliant on China, completely over reliant on China and dependent on China for our manufacturing base. So much of our infrastructure is now going back, of course, our parts, our manufacturing base is all going back to China. And so that's where you have China now working forward, pushing their new system around the world. And it becomes harder for us to combat it because in doing so, we're going to have, and I say we in sort of the royal sense, we in terms of the West, are going to go through some growing pains if we want to actually affect change on that problem.
Yeah, it's gonna hurt, but it's necessary. I think anyway. Anyway, moving on. You were actually you cover Antifa. You cover them pretty closely, and you actually went to check out one of these autonomous zones that they set up in the middle of these protests, and it didn't go particularly well. You were assaulted by a few of the Antifa members, I think. So could you give us a rundown on that story? What exactly happened?
It's two situations, right? And it's so hard to kind of place together some of these because there's so much Antifa and Antifa related violence going on in the United States and throughout the West right now.
Hmm.
So when I went to the autonomous zone out in Seattle, I was able to infiltrate there. I was able to report on what was going on, those activities, 3 days, 3 nights, completely undetected and unmolested. While I was there, I was able to get right up, literally standing next to Raz Simone in some cases, getting him on film, cocking his gun, chasing people down the streets who were suspected of being thieves, the fires that were being lit. We actually got out before the shooting started, but I predicted that it would descend very quickly into violence.
Yeah.
The mayor and the police didn't get back in there. And unfortunately, it did descend into violence. There were multiple shootings that took place, multiple murders that took place, including one at the hands of reportedly at the hands of the so-called barricade guards, the John Brown Gun Club and their allies who were protecting, quote unquote, this autonomous zone. And then so later on, after that, when I had my incident with Antifa, was actually at a protest that I was covering back in Washington, D.C. So now we're back on the East Coast. And I'm in Washington, D.C., and they've called for this statue, the original statue of Abraham Lincoln in Washington, D.C., that was erected in the 1870s, actually 1876. So about a decade after he was assassinated. Frederick Douglass, who was an advisor, he was himself a freed slave, an advisor to Lincoln during the war, spoke at it, gave a really long soliloquy about Lincoln's record and how he sort of overcame his own personal failings. And the statue itself had been dedicated and paid for by funds donated and raised from freed slaves and former slaves from prior to the Civil War.
Yeah.
It was this incredible moment that I wanted to capture for One American News. And as we're out there, my team gets identified by a few people. At first, they just sort of start heckling us. So we stood our ground and continued filming, continued doing the work. And at that point, members of Antifa, and this is how Antifa operates, right? So they interject themselves into larger groups. They exploit other organizations, in this case, Black Lives Matter, to further their own goals and their own ends. Black Lives Matter is predominantly an anti-police, at this point, anti-police protest movement, has shifted in some cases towards tearing down these statues. But then Antifa, they're a whole anti-government insurrectionist movement. Their goals don't expressly align with those of Black Lives Matter. However, they know that Black Lives Matter is a larger group, so they can use them to fit their own ends and then become accelerationists and use their violence to perpetuate this. And what's interesting, and Jack Jr. really wants to talk about this. That's why he's right now. And my mother-in-law is with us. I think she'll grab him in a second. But so what Antifa did was then they came up and started screaming at me. And to sort of put it there, and I don't know if you guys have the clip of it, but the geography of the area of that facility is there's actually there's a statue, there's a pedestal, there's a concrete area, then there's a few concrete steps leading to a concrete plane that goes out throughout the middle of the park there. It's called the Emancipation Memorial. Mm-hmm. And so I was standing on the steps getting an upward angle shot of the speakers as they were speaking. However, at that point, members of Antifa accosted me and attempted to actually push me down the steps so that they were attempting to get me to fall and potentially crack my skull on the concrete, which was below.
Yeah, pretty vicious.
So at that point, I merely stood my ground peacefully. I've mentioned this before, but as a Catholic, in those moments, you just start praying. And I was in my mind sort of praying the prayer to St. Michael the Archangel over and over, just almost like a mantra, St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection, et cetera, et cetera. And then one of the speakers, actually someone who was against tearing down the statue, a guy by the name of Don Folden, who runs DC Black History Tours, came down off the pedestal, walked with me, and then took me out together so we could try to have a conversation. At that point, Antifa followed us and attempted to provoke me, screaming all sorts of nonsense and craziness in my face, trying to get me going, trying to get me to swing, trying to get me to do something to react. In my mind, again, St. Michael the Archangel, St. Michael the Archangel.
Yeah.
And, eventually, even as we left the park, they kept following us into the street. They followed us down through a city block. I was actually walking away from where my car was parked because I didn't want to give out that location. I didn't want them to see where my vehicle was, because we all know how they react when they see someone's personal vehicle.
Yeah.
And so eventually, kicking me, striking me, putting their hands on my neck, trying to knock me down, et cetera, et cetera. But I didn't want to, and I've seen people, I like to address, I've seen a lot of people say, well, Poso, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you just deck one of those guys? Man, you're big, they're little. You were in the Navy, you've got all sorts of training. You can easily take out those guys, right? Here's how that would play out. That video, would get cut, would get spliced, because we live in an era of fake news and disinformation. We have media outlets that literally exist to produce fake news and perpetuate it on the American people. And these are massive outlets. So what would happen is the entire context of the situation would be lost. That clip of me cocking my fist back to punch forward would be shown. You're seeing this actually now with the federal officers in Portland. And they wouldn't show anything that had preceded it. So it would make me look like the aggressor. And then I'd have to go fight that out. Also, that would make it tougher for the legal case, because now instead of it being assault or battery, now you've got an altercation. There was a back and forth. And so you've got two sides sort of going at it in terms of that. So that's all going through my head as this is happening. This is my first rodeo, guys. And so I understand what the implications, like, have situation awareness, understand where you are, understand the moment you're in, understand the implications of your own actions. And at that point, you know, I said, you know what, prayer is going to be the best response, but also I'm going to stand my ground. I actually said to the kid at one point, I'm not going to run away. Right? I'm here to do my job. I'm here to report on what's going on. I don't agree with you taking down these statues. I don't agree with you taking down history, number one, but also attempting to tear down federal property or federal statute. It's a crime. Okay, that's a crime. So that would make you a criminal. And if I'm going to get evidence of you committing a crime on that statue, or in this case on myself, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, and you're totally right. They would have demonized you instantly, and it would have been played on every major platform, and you would have been condemned by the sort of establishment once again. So, you know, good on you for being so careful. The issue is with Antifa is that they're highly disorganized, I think anyway, and no one really knows, aside from a few select journalists, how they actually work. So how is Antifa structured?
Yeah, so John Robb actually has a great quote or a great phrase for Antifa. And he's someone who studied insurgent movements throughout the Middle East. He's also studied the color revolutions that took place in the Arab Spring, and then also in Ukraine, the Maidan. And so I'd love to take credit for this one, but it's John Robb, two B's, and he calls it an open source movement. And I thought that it's just such a clever term that I've got to give him credit, and I've got to double tap that one, because an open source movement is essentially an organization that has as you just rightly explained, a loose structure, a loose hierarchy, a loose confederacy of people that swell and shrink as events go, as the news cycle goes, and allow people into their movement in a very distinct and fluid manner. And so this isn't something where we're talking about like a terrorist organization like Al Qaeda that has, that has hierarchy, that has leaders, that has shura councils, right? You're not talking about something like a police force or a paramilitary unit that has, leaders and platoons and everything else. That being said, Antifa typically uses a sort of tiered structure when they go into one of their actions. And so first and foremost, they use front groups. And you can go on Antifa websites like Crime Think and It's Going Down, where they talk about this. They say approach larger, more established organizations like Black Lives Matter or the immigration, I think one's Refugees Without Borders. Go to one of those organizations and use them as recruiting tools. Democrat Socialists of America, DSA, is another great example of this. Go out there, recruit from them, but don't approach them as a member of Antifa. Approach them as saying, "Oh, I'm just anti-racist," or "Oh, I just, I'm for inclusion in society." One of these various social justice pablums that are out there. But then when the event takes place, you essentially see, from a tactical perspective, 3 tiers to an Antifa black bloc. There's 3 tiers to a black bloc. So tier 3, that's the green tier. So tier 3 is the people who are just sort of the day trippers, the sightseers, the tourists, the kids who are saying, sure, I'll dress in black and fight the patriarchy and fight against these demons, invisible phantoms of widespread police corruption and police racism, all of which don't actually hold up when you start looking at statistical analysis. But again, these are primarily motivated by viral videos. They're not primarily motivated by stats and analysis and facts and evidence. And so that's your tier 3. That's your largest tier of a black bloc. Now, what's interesting about tier 3, and usually when I give this breakdown, I stop there. But what's interesting is because since so many of these incidents are taking place during the coronavirus pandemic, as we already mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, those people wearing coronavirus masks then become part of the black bloc themselves, because they're masked. In some case, they're wearing a hood, they're wearing a hat, maybe not so much in the summer now, but they then become a massive black bloc through which Antifa or Antifa members can then operate with impunity. In fact, it actually, I hate to give them advice, but if they start showing up without wearing all black and simply wearing mask and nondescript clothing, it's going to be even harder to identify them and to pair them out because they're operating in that crowd. So if they dress like the crowd, they're going to disappear in that crowd. Tier 2, that's your yellow tier. So tier 2 are organizers, facilitators, leaders, people who understand what's going on, people who are smart enough to know how to put out these calls. They have very just different calls and maneuvers that they use. They say alerta, they say mic check. They talk about where they're going to be moving next, what's going to happen. They'll usually bring a bullhorn or a megaphone, some implement of being able to speak to the entire crowd. And they have a sense of authority. They are also the ones that usually lead the chants. And I've gone and covered this group from London to Milan, Italy, to all across the United States. And you hear the same chants, you hear the exact same phrases being spoken. Now, some of that's organized and some of that's just open source. You know, they use hashtags, they use Facebook, they use social media, they use Discord, Telegram, the same way everybody else does. Third, you have tier 1. So tier 1, or the red tier, are those that are actually doing the direct action. Those are the guys, and it's a pyramid structure. So we're going smaller to, or largest to smallest. So largest is green, then yellow, and then red is the smallest. Those are the ones performing the actual direct action and violence. So tier 1, those are the people, and you saw this in Beverly Hills. And through this, imagine this, Rodeo Drive, Beverly Hills, they're running down, one guy's got a hammer, smashes the windows of all those name brand stores. The next guy comes in and is throwing already lit, pre-lit smoke bombs in through the windows, which then goes through, in some cases it's fireworks, or you maybe even something a little rougher, like a flashbang or a quarter stick or an M80, right? Or Molotov cocktails. You saw Molotov cocktails being used throughout all of this. We're calling it the summer of Antifa. And so that's a tactical operation that you're looking at. That isn't something that's happening organically. That's not someone who says, oh, I see a guy with a hammer, I'll just get my Molotov. No. This is planning, this is premeditation, this is intent. Okay, that's tier 1, red tier Antifa. Those are also the ones that you see committing the violence against police officers, the violence against, we saw attacks on police animals, attacks on Trump supporters, conservatives, or anyone that they perceive to be a Trump supporter or a conservative. When I was in Chaz, you saw people getting choked out simply for being a Christian street preacher, right? You go to any major city, you know, you're going to see the Christian street preachers. They're out there. They've got a little megaphone, or maybe like a little amplifier, like guitar amplifier and a microphone, and they're preaching the good word, and they're on the side of the road, and more power to them. And you know, most people, if you want to listen, you can listen. Or give them $1, you give them $1. If you don't want to listen, you just keep walking. They're not causing any trouble. Yet they choked that guy out. They grabbed him, and I watched. And as this thing went on, it went on for almost half an hour of them pulling and prodding him, and eventually dragging him out by his arms to get him away. Okay, that's not something that's done by a peaceful protester. So tier 1, that's your direct action, that's your red tier. And of course, there's movement between the various tiers. It's not something that's hard and fast because, as Sean Robb highlighted, this is open source, it's fluid, there's a lot of movement here, and it's not organized in the sense of having specific hierarchy and leadership and ranks, but you do see various front groups like Refuse Fascism that are very well funded. You've seen the National Lawyers Guild, which provides legal services to them, pro bono, which is also very well funded, and various other, they're called affinity groups that they work with around the country. That again, you know, a person shows up one day, they're wearing a I don't like Donald Trump shirt, and they're just, you know, they're chanting Black Lives Matter. Then they show up at night and they're dressed in all black and they're smashing windows, right? So even though it's the same person, right, they're operating under various different hats, various different shades. And so you've got to be able to figure out who that person is at any given time. You're also seeing this in Portland right now. with this new sort of agitprop that they're using, where they're calling it moms of Antifa or Momtifa, that are standing in line, sort of arms linked, in front of this federal courthouse, while Antifa goes in behind them and then starts assaulting the courthouse, going after the federal officers, the police officers inside, trying to burn this place down. Then at some points of the night, the same individuals will get changed into all black, come back, and then also start participating in the attacks themselves.
Yeah, it's shocking. And as you mentioned, so you have these tier one protesters, and on top of that, it is quite disorganized. So is it possible, and do you think it was a good, I suppose, policy idea for Donald Trump to label Antifa as a whole a terrorist organization?
Well, I think what he's done is he's labeled their acts as the acts of a terrorist movement. And what's very important about that is the understanding of what that does. As a prior intelligence officer, I understand what's going on here. This when you label something terrorism in the Department of Justice, this opens up a whole new set of authorities, capabilities, intelligence features and functions, collection capabilities that are now able to be used against them. You've got the Attorney General signing these authorities into place for the collectors, for the investigators, and for federal agents. That opens up a whole new swath of completely legal, by the way, or designations that are allowed to them under law. And of course, that's now started to become the new debate here in the United States, is how far do we want to go with that? Does it cross the line of prosecuting peaceful protesters, which is obviously something we don't want, or are they only using these against violent members of Antifa? And so that is obviously something that in any democracy you're going to want to be careful about, because we do support, by the way, peaceful protest. But we're seeing going on with the tearing down of statues across the country, the establishment of Chaz, which led to murders of black teenagers, by the way, in Seattle, and the siege tactics that are being used in the city of Portland. These are not peaceful protests, and you have to draw a line in the sand somewhere. And yeah, people saying, "Oh, shouldn't they just? What if they just came out in like a beat cop in patrol uniform, and wouldn't that de-escalate things?" Look, when you've got people that are using firebombs on a federal courthouse, you don't know what kind of situation you're getting into. You're potentially, and you've got to prepare for every potential situation that could arise. So that means the kid with a firecracker all the way up to the next potential Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City federal building, right? And so you have to prepare with that mindset. And that's obviously not a place that everybody wants their country to be in. But if you want to go back to achieve that sense of normalcy, you've got to take out these bad actors in terms of legally apprehending them, bringing them to justice, preventing these burnings from happening, doing something that's safe, not just to the individuals that are conducting it, but also anyone else who may be a bystander, journalist, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. There has to be order. But anyway, Jack, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you coming on. You've been an absolute star, and I hope you come back sometime in the future.
Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. Got a 2-year-old over here. It's almost nap time. So we're gonna go deal with that. That sounds like a tier one. Sounds like tier one nap time behind me there. So we got to get into it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Jack.